My name is Pamela Mejia, and we're here for More Than Mass Shootings. What can we learn from an analysis of California news about gun violence? We're delighted to have you here. Of course, this is a challenging topic to talk about and one that we wish we didn't necessarily have to, but we do, more so now than ever, and we're thrilled to be in this space with you and really have the chance to dig into some larger questions about narrative change, and what our findings mean for California and beyond. Before we get started, I want to, of course, make sure that we clear up any and all technical issues. If you do have any technical problems, the phone number for WebEx is on the screen. And if you do have an immediate question, please send a message to the chat box to our host, Heather Gellert, whose name you'll see in the drag-down menu in the lower corner of your screen, of your WebEx screen. We want today to be as interactive as the format will allow. So if you have questions throughout, we really encourage you to please send them in using the chat box. And we suggest using the phrase, all participants, if you'd like things to go to everybody. I believe if you select all attendees, it'll only go to other guests, but if you want panelists to see your questions, please do select all participants when you send that out. And then, but you know, this is a pretty small group. We're very fortunate to have been able to bring together all the folks who are here today. And so if you would like to speak via phone, there's going to be some opportunities to ask and answer questions throughout the presentation. So, and if people would like to use the chat box for that, they may. But if you'd like to speak via the phone and really give voice to your questions, I know sometimes I have an easier time expressing myself when I can talk. Please use the raise your hand function. And then our host, Heather Gellert, will take a second or two to take you off mute, and you'll be free to ask that question. And I will kind of give prompts throughout to remind folks that that is an option. And of course, during the presentation, during the data presentation itself, again, it might be easier to use the chat box, but if you have a burning question and you really want to ask it, don't hesitate to raise your hand, and we will take you off mute and hear what you have to say. And hopefully have a really rich discussion about it throughout. Again, very excited about the possibilities of having this particular group together in space to talk. I wanted to make sure to have a quick moment to introduce today's presenters. Many of you are here because of Brian Malsey, the Executive Director of the Hope and Heal Fund, who's going to be doing some really important context sharing and setting the stage for this. He's really who made all of this work possible. My colleague Daphne Marble is here with me. She's a Communications Research Associate at Berkeley Media Studies Group, and she's the head researcher on this project and is going to be sharing some of the key findings and also thinking through some of what with us together, what some of these can mean and the implications going forward for changing narratives around gun violence in California and elsewhere. And again, I myself am Pamela Mejia. I'm head of research here at Berkeley Media Studies Group, and I'm delighted to be here facilitating today, hopefully asking and answering questions, and like all of us, learning a lot. I wanted to say a little bit about what we're going to be doing today. I find it's always helpful to start with a little bit of an overview. We'll introduce the Berkeley Media Studies Group for those of you who are not familiar with who we are, and Brian will say a bit about Hope and Heal Fund. And as I said, do a bit of context setting for why this project and why now. We're a week after the 2-year anniversary of the Pulse nightclub shooting. We're several months after some of the largest shootings in recent U.S. history. There's lots to talk about, but we're also, you know, in the midst of a much more silent and less publicized epidemic that's been ongoing of other kinds of gun violence that are as important to talk about and really need to be part of the narrative as well. So we're really excited for the opportunity to hear a little bit again of that larger context and environment for why we're here today and why now, and to share a little bit about what brought this project to light. Daphne's going to share findings from the news analysis, and then we're going to talk about recommendations for for advocates, for practitioners, for anybody who's interested in changing the narrative, as well as some next steps in our work together and apart. And finally, there'll be a question and comment section at the end, though by no means should you restrict yourself to that. Please do feel free to ask questions at any time. I'll be monitoring the chat box, and of course, keeping an eye out for anybody who wants to raise their hand and speak via the phone. I'll say a little bit about who we are. I'll start with Berkeley Media Studies Group. We are a very small public health organization. We're meeting with Daphne and myself, about 20% of the staff today. Or excuse me, I can't do math, about 10% of the staff today. And we conduct research on different media narratives about public health and social justice issues, including news coverage, as well as other types of media. We provide media advocacy training and strategic consultation for community groups, public health practitioners, really anybody who wants to get better at using the media to communicate strategically and make the case for public health and social change, or who just wants to get better at communicating strategically in general through any medium. And finally, we provide professional education for journalists to equip them with the tools and resources to ask questions, connect with sources, and tell stories that include broader perspectives on not only the problems that face us, but the solutions, including community-based solutions that are central to solving them. And as I noted earlier, we are a project of the Public Health Institute. And now I'm going to pass the baton of speaking, as it were, over to Brian, who's going to share a little bit about the Hope and Heal Fund and talk a little bit more about what led the Hope and Heal Fund to support this work as one of its inaugural grants. Brian?
Great. Pam, I'm going to ask you if you can hear me okay, then I know everyone can hear me.
I can hear you great.
Great. Good morning, everybody. Brian Malty, Executive Director of the Hope and Heal Fund, and first I want to thank everybody for joining this call this morning. Thank you for taking time out of your day. Thank you to Berkeley Media Studies Group. I'm very excited about this project. So I think most of you know somewhat or a little bit or a lot about Hope and Heal. We are a collaborative fund. We have 13 foundation partners and 13 individual donors, and they're growing by the day. And I want to thank those donor partners who are on the phone today, because you help make this possible, this first important step in the narrative change on gun violence prevention here in California. So thank you, thank you. Just really quickly about Hope and Heal, and you can see on the slide that we take a public health approach to gun violence here in California, and what those drivers of gun violence are, which are suicide, which in California represent over 50% of all gun deaths. We work to keep guns out of the hands of domestic abusers, and we take action to keep our neighborhoods safe so that young people can go outside without fear and violence. So suicide, domestic violence, community violence, that's our focus. Why this project? Why now? I think for those of you that know me, I've been in the gun violence prevention space doing many different things for the last 25 years, and a lot of that was spent working nationally at the Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence. And while I felt, you know, we do, and they still do, and a lot of groups do a lot of great work, one of the things that I felt was missing was a focus on the communities most affected by gun violence. And these communities often are the communities that receive the least attention. Even if there's successes in some of these communities, which there are, I've been across the state visiting communities up and down California, there's a lot of great stuff going on and a lot of effective and really promising things happening, but these aren't being lifted up in the media. So, you know, when I walked in the door at Hope and Heal, I was a little bit tired of hearing, you know, nationally and otherwise in the gun violence prevention movement, we should talk differently about gun violence. So when I first walked through the doors, it's like, let's actually do it, right? Let's actually start this project and you know, start to change the narrative on gun violence. And a lot of this, of course, too, is really to help lift up the things that I've seen, and a lot of you maybe on the phone are working on those community strategies that are making a difference be able to help lift those up. So we know gun violence is a public health crisis that kills 30,000, actually more than 30,000 Americans every year. I think the good news is that gun violence is preventable. Community leaders across the country are taking meaningful steps to end the epidemic. And we know that California has been a strong gun leader in gun violence prevention. But while we have strong gun laws, some of which, you know, I had the privilege of working on the Brady campaign, California is also pioneering innovative community-based programs like Advanced Peace, ceasefire, and other strategies to prevent gun violence at the community level. The media coverage, as we'll find out shortly, and no surprise to a lot of you, focuses a lot on mass shootings and overlooks the everyday violence, like domestic violence and suicide. It also presents gun violence as inevitable, and solutions are unattainable. To achieve real progress, we have to change the narrative, one that is solution-based and inspires people to act. And that's why we partner with the Berkeley Media Studies Group, who obviously is a great leader in media research on public health issues, and I've known some of the folks there for, you know, as long as I've been in this movement. So partnering with them was, you know, kind of a no-brainer for us here at the Hope and Heal Fund, and we're thrilled to share the findings with you all today. So in the wake of Parkland, in the wake of some of the mass shootings that we've seen, this work is more important than ever. So let's just talk really quickly the things that a lot of you already know, but just as important to reiterate. On average, per day in the United States, 96 Americans are killed with guns. In an average month, 50 women are shot to death by intimate partners in the United States. And 62% of all fire deaths in the U.S. are suicides, as we mentioned. In California, it's a bit over 50%. So, you know, just really quickly before I pass it back to Pam and Daphne, is kind of what we see, what I see are the key barriers to communicating about ending gun violence in California. Well, first, ending gun violence, that's what we do, and that's the work that we need to do. You know, we read about gun violence every day, but quickly move on, you know, from the sadness and concern to everyday life. We have to disrupt a series of behaviors that cause us to read, feel, and ignore, or at the very least, put this issue aside. And to do that, we have to believe we can end gun violence. We've learned that when people hear information from their peers, they're more often likely to believe it. Their peers, community members starting programs, or people who have experienced violence struggle with how to talk about their work and their experiences, ways to empower others to act. They need tips and training, and they need reinforcement from the news media. You know, stories that share how communities are addressing preventing gun violence, stories about how help us understand domestic violence and suicide so we become more willing to talk about them. The stories that reinforce that we can end gun violence, something we know because people in communities across California are just doing that already. So preparing those storytellers to share their work is part of it, and working with the news media to identify how they can better inform and engage audiences is crucial, and that's why we're here today. So with that, without further ado, I will pass it back to Pam and Daphne, and we'll go from there. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Brian. So before we dive into the data, I'll just say that one of the questions we always ask here at BMSG is, if people only learned about this issue from the news, what would they know and what wouldn't they know? And the reason that we ask that question is because we know for a lot of people that's true. You know, the news, as we know, in some cases more now than ever, really sets the agenda, determining what we're thinking about and what we're not thinking about, and shaping the debate in terms of affecting how we're thinking about it. You know, who has a voice in the conversation, whose stories are left out, what solutions appear, or do solutions appear, or is it framed as a never-ending series of problems? And the news is also important just as such an agenda-setting tool, not because it reaches only the general public, but also because it can reach the people who can do something about the environments and the systems where gun violence happens, opinion leaders and decision makers from, you know, your local school board all the way up the ladder. So it's critically important that we understand the narratives that the media is sharing about our issue, in this case gun violence, the epidemic of gun violence, and also what the opportunities and limitations inherent in those stories are, and ways that we can see forward to lifting up what we want to see more of and changing what we would like to see less of, perhaps. So with all that said, that was really what led us, all those different pieces were what led us to the issue brief that we're here to talk about today, which is available on our website at bmsg.org, and Heather will probably be putting the link in the chat box in just a moment. It's called More Than Mass Shootings, Gun Violence Narratives in California, and it's the result of about a 6 months to a year's worth of work together with the Hope and Heal Fund, with many of the partners who were here on this webinar who contributed really powerful and important thinking about how to read the news about gun violence, what to look for, and also, how to think about what we were finding and how to analyze and interpret the news. We're going to dive in now to the findings of the news analysis, since I think that's probably what most folks are here for. But before we do, I'll say just a little tiny bit about our methods, so you'll understand how we got to where we got. We searched the LexisNexis News archive for articles published in over 40 California outlets between October 15th of 2016 and October 14th of 2017. We had originally planned to end our analysis on October 1st of 2017, the same day that one of the largest shootings in recent U.S. history happened in Las Vegas, Nevada. And so we extended our search period so we could see a little bit more of what the news about or immediately following a mass shooting would look like, although, again, our interest here is really in those day-to-day acts that often don't grab headlines. We used tailored search terms to search for each of the three kinds of violence that Brian spoke about earlier. So for each set of stories, we did look for anything referencing firearms, gun, gunman, gunfire, gunshot, shot, shooting, but we also looked for the terms that related to each of the three types of gun violence. So, for example, for suicide, we would be looking for suicide or self-harm. For domestic violence, we would be looking for all the different variants of domestic violence, domestic abuse, intimate partner battery, domestic battery. And for community-level violence, we would be looking for phrases that reference not only those gun terms, but also things like gang-related, prison, et cetera. We developed a research and fieldwork-informed coding instrument, so again, based not only on our and others' previous research on guns and gun violence in the news, but also on deep conversations with folks, some of whom are here today, who really shared their own thinking, frustrations, and questions about the media that really helped us get a sense of what we should and could and couldn't be looking for in the news. And our coding instrument is really unique, and this is, again, this is the first time this has really been done, allowed us to look at three kinds of gun violence and really compare them across different themes, different speaker categories, et cetera. Typically, in the past, research on gun violence has focused narrowly on, in the news, has focused narrowly on one particular kind of gun violence. So this is an exciting method that we've really been developing and is very unique. And finally, we conducted intercoder reliability testing to ensure that coder agreement wasn't happening by chance, that anybody who was trained on this coding instrument and read these articles could be expected to see the same things that we saw. And all additional information about our methods is available in the issue brief, which is the link to which is currently in the chat box. I want to say two quick things before Daphne dives into the results. The first is I spoke a little bit earlier about the Las Vegas shooting. As I said earlier, we were really focused in this analysis on understanding that the gun violence that doesn't make news, that doesn't get headlines as often, but that accounts for the majority of injuries and fatalities in our country every day. But we can't talk about gun violence in this country in this moment without also talking about mass shootings, unfortunately. So in the aftermath of the Las Vegas shooting, we did a quick analysis. We saw, first of all, as you'll see when Daphne presents our findings, that really it did not have a significant impact on stories about gun violence and community violence, gun violence and domestic violence, or gun violence and suicide. I'll say that again. The Las Vegas shooting, which was the single largest in recent U.S. history, did not significantly change the coverage of gun violence and community violence, gun violence and domestic violence, or gun violence and suicide. You may be thinking to yourself, well, that can't be right. I've seen tons of stories in the news every day after a mass shooting happens. That's true. And as you'll see on the screen, after a shooting happens, there is a very big spike in coverage, but that's coverage that uses phrases like mass shooting, assault weapons, or that specifically references the name of the shooter and the location of the shooting. So this spike you're seeing here really reflects a pretty unique pool of articles that is unrelated to the articles and the stories that we're going to be talking about here. And I think that that in and of itself represents a fairly interesting finding, that the narratives we're used to about gun violence and mass shootings are certainly not the narratives about the kinds of violence that affect us in our communities every day. So just as you're looking at this chart, note that the numbers down there at the bottom are days, not months. So we've charted each day of coverage leading up to the shooting that use any of the phrases gun, firearm, mass shooting, or assault weapon, and then charted afterward. And that's where those spikes really happened. And those are the articles that we're used to seeing every day dominating the coverage in the aftermath of a mass shooting event. The other thing I really wanted to say before we dig into the findings is a little bit about the papers that we looked at. I mentioned on that first slide about methods that we looked at over 40 outlets published around California, and this slide gives an indication of where those were located. The markers in blue, the markers in red are all the papers in California that we drew from, and the markers in blue are all the papers that got pulled into our scientifically selected samples. So essentially, as you're looking at this map, think to yourself, we were looking at outlets from all of those places in red. And you can see that that really represents a very, very broad swath of the state, including rural California, places that tend to vote more progressive, places that tend to vote more conservative, places where the ethnic and racial makeup differs markedly from one another, places where the population density is quite different. So this was a very representative slice of the entirety of the state of California, which, as we know, is possibly our most diverse state in the country, and really represents a huge, broad swath of the different communities that comprise our country. Brian, did you want to say anything else at this point about sort of our thinking around bringing in different sections of California, or anything about kind of the implications of California as a site for this analysis? I know I kind of put you on the spot there, so it's okay if not.
That's okay. I think it's really important that, this is that representative sample of California, because as we know, there's the suicide, which takes place a lot in more rural communities, community violence, which takes place more in urban communities. It was really, really important that we get out in terms of finding, to sample all these newspapers in different parts of California, because gun violence does look a little different depending on where you go. And in order to get the information we need to really take a deep dive look at suicide, domestic violence, and community violence, it was really, really important that we get out to all these different places and really cover California to get a true picture of what we're talking about. So I really appreciate all the work that you all did, because some of these articles were, you had to really take a deep dive to try to get them and work extra hard to get them. So I really appreciate it, but I think it's a really great sample.
Thank you so much, Brian.
And Pam, we just have a question that came in through the chat box. It didn't come into the panelists' view, so sorry about that. But it's from Anara Gard, who says, newspapers only, how might the results differ if TV were included? I understand that analyzing broadcasts is much more difficult.
Yeah, that's a great question. So as you'll see, we analyzed primarily print news as well as its online equivalents, and newspapers are all by and large online at this point, as well as the photographs associated with them, because we know that there's a lot that can't be captured in the written word, picture telling 1,000 words and whatnot. So we did attempt to capture some of the nuances that might be come through with a more visual medium in our analysis, as you'll see. I do think that you're right, that there's a really interesting question to be asked and story to be told looking at broadcast media. My assumption would be that many of the trends that we're seeing here would be fairly consistent, just based on previous analyses and based on the fact that online traditional media continues in many spaces to set the agenda for other types of traditional media. So print sets it for TV and vice versa. I would also say that I wanted to flag, I failed to mention it in the method slide, but I should have, that we also looked at Spanish language media. Spanish language print media in California is a dwindling industry, even more so than other types of print media. And one thing that I think would be a really interesting next step around this would be to be able to look more in depth at Spanish language broadcasts like Univision and Telemundo, because I do know in our Spanish-speaking communities, there's a considerably less Spanish-speaking only print media available. Great question, thank you. All right, so before I pass it off to Daphne, we've talked a lot, and I want to make sure, I know part of the goal of this sort of selected group is really that we would love to hear from folks and have the opportunity to have a discussion. And so before we dive in and talk, I'd love to hear if anybody wants to share either via the chat box or via the phone, if you can just raise your hand. Something about the narrative that you'd want to see, or what, the things that we would, if every slide that's to come reflected exactly what you would hope would be in the narrative, what would be there? Whose stories would be lifted up, what stories would be told, et cetera. I'll start the ball rolling by saying that for myself, as someone who works pretty extensively in domestic and sexual violence prevention, I would love to see a really rich narrative about domestic violence and its intersections with gun violence, because I think until we get to a point where those conversations are happening, we can't really address a problem we don't know is there. So other folks, anybody wish to kind of weigh in or have any thoughts they want to share on what they would like to see or what they expect not to see, perhaps, or would hope to see? And if not, I'm going to pass it off to Daphne and let her dig in. All right, you know what, Daphne? I think I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'm going to bump to you, okay? But again, feel free to hop in, folks, at any point with questions and comments.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Pam. So picking up from where Pamela left off, thinking about the narratives that we saw, the narratives that we would like to see. Unfortunately, the narrative that we did see in our news analysis differs significantly from, I think, what we all would hope to see out there. So here is the overall picture of how many articles about gun violence appeared in California news. And I'll give you all a moment to take this in, just to kind of set up the chart, and this will be the pattern for all charts going forward. The blue line is community violence and gun articles. The red line is domestic violence and gun news articles, and the green line is suicide and gun articles. So now everyone's kind of had a chance to orient themselves with the chart. As you can see, stories about suicide and domestic violence involving guns rarely appeared in the news. California news outlets regularly cover stories about community violence and guns, but really they rarely report on domestic violence and suicide as gun violence issues. And this is a pattern that we'll be talking about throughout the analysis. And just to let you know, this is the entire universe that we studied. The subsequent slides as part of the analysis will look at our sample. But we really just want to give you this picture because it's so important to put the study into context and to show just how much community violence news dominates this coverage, and to think about how little people will know about domestic violence and suicide as gun violence issues based on this. This is also I just want to take this moment to highlight the uniqueness of this project, because this is really, although there has been other research on gun violence in the news, this is the first time that an analysis of this kind has been done, looking across these three very different but fundamentally connected types of gun violence. So we want to know a bit about what types of stories are being published about gun violence, before we get to anything else. So Here we can see the coverage about gun violence is overwhelmingly dominated by straight news stories. That's the first column, and that is 89% of all stories. Just again to orient everyone to what's on the chart, community violence is in blue, domestic violence is in red, suicide is in green, and this will be the way throughout. And this is our sample so that we can really dig into the substantive articles that we studied. As you can see here, really, there were so few opinion articles in our sample, and opinion articles refer to letters to the editor, editorials, columns, op-eds, and this tells us a bit about the room in the narrative for advocates to be contributing opinion articles, which we'll talk a bit down the line. But when we mention this, I want you to keep in mind this chart that just shows the absence of news in the opinion space. One thing that I would like to highlight is that opinion articles appeared much more frequently in stories related to suicide than in stories about community violence and domestic violence. And this distinction between news coverage of suicide versus news coverage of community violence and domestic violence and guns is a pattern that we'll really see throughout the entire analysis. So something that we're very interested in here at BMSG is how an article is framed. And framing is really one of the first things that we consider in all of our analyses. Here you can see a simple way to distinguish between how stories are framed. And this is to imagine the difference between a portrait, which is what we have on the left, and then a landscape story, which is what we have on the right. In a news story framed as a portrait, audiences might learn a lot about an individual or a specific event, but it's hard to see what surrounds individuals or what brought them to those circumstances. And then you can imagine that with a landscape story, this kind of pulls back the lens, and it takes a broader view of what's around those individuals. And it might still include individuals, and so it could include people and events, but the key thing with a landscape story is that it connects the individuals to the larger social and economic forces surrounding them. So now you might be wondering, okay, well, why do we care so much about how a news story is framed? Well, the reason it's so important is because research shows that stories that are framed as portraits will evoke solutions that focus on individual responsibility. However, when people see stories that have been framed as landscapes, they're more likely to recognize solutions that don't focus exclusively on individuals. And their ideas for solutions will focus on institutional responsibility. So this is to say, the policies and institutions that shape conditions around people. And these are the solutions that we really want people to be thinking about, because we know that this is the way to change an issue. Of course, the next step was to say, well, how are the news stories about gun violence being framed? And I'm sorry to say that 70% of the stories in our sample across the board were framed as portraits, and we only saw 30% that were framed as landscapes. And this was a general pattern in suicide, domestic violence, and community violence stories. However, this pattern did differ a bit across the three groups. So here you can see the orange bar represents episodic stories, or those that are framed as portraits, and the turquoise greenish bars, thematic stories. So those are the landscape stories that we wish we were seeing more of. And as we've mentioned on the previous slide, overwhelmingly, the news about gun violence was more likely to use a portrait frame. However, as you can see on this slide in the third column, suicide and gun violence news had a larger proportion of portrait-framed articles than community violence or domestic violence did. And we'll see a bit more about why this was as we walk through our results. So why did we see such a high amount of portrait-framed stories across the board? Well, this is because the news stories about gun violence were overwhelmingly in the news because of a specific incident. And we can see this reflected here in this chart. Now as part of our coding of the articles, we've looked at what were the stories about, why were they in the news on that day, what was the topic. Overwhelmingly, the topic was specific incidents. And this was especially true for community violence and gun articles. So I'll stop doing this at one point, but just to reorient you, since we had a different chart before, this is the blue stories are community violence, red domestic violence, and green suicide. So 85% of the community violence articles were about specific incidents of violence, and the majority of those described were gang or prison violence. Domestic violence also focused heavily on specific incidents, but suicide and guns were a bit less likely to focus on specific incidents than the other two categories. And these tended, as you can see, the suicide articles also focused on mental health, policy, and research, which was just not something that we saw in domestic violence and community violence.
We have a quick question on the phone, so I'm gonna Steve Bosato, I think Heather's gonna take you off of mute, if that's all right. So just give us a quick second. Steve, can you hear me?
Steve.
Hi there.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good.
Sure can.
Do we count how many times the NRA's agenda got mentioned in the articles?
Yes, we did, and we were actually you'll see this on in a few slides. We talk a bit about whose perspectives are included, and so we'll talk about this a bit more. But we were surprised to see that it didn't appear very frequently in the sample, and we did kind of hypothesis that this might have to do with the fact that these types of violence aren't being talked about on the national stage the way that mass shootings are when you'll have like an NRA member weighing into the national debate. So we'll talk about it a bit more.
And I will say that when I did an analysis, as you saw on an earlier slide, of how the news immediately following a mass shooting appears, they certainly were very, very present in those stories, to Daphne's point.
Mm-hmm. And just to flag, these are, we were, to come to our findings, we did group things together. So the policy stories could have been, a pro-gun policy story.
Right. I mean, they're just very effective in what they do, and the question is, what can we learn from them, and how can we outfox them?
That's a great question. That's a great.
Yeah, just a comment. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Well, as Daphne mentioned, we'll be where relevant, we'll be highlighting the role of the gun lobby as it appears throughout, but it is certainly worth noting that they were not as present in stories about day-to-day violence as they are in stories about mass shootings that really capture the national spotlight and sort of the national zeitgeist. Well, I guess that actually brings us to a great question. Thank you, Steve, for setting up our next piece so well, too, is thinking a little bit about who should have a voice in stories about gun violence. When we were talking about framing earlier on, we spoke about how who has a voice and who doesn't is so critical in shaping the way that we think about issues. And so just sort of thinking about who we would want to be part of these stories, I'm just curious if this group has thoughts, and this I think also kind of might speak to some of the issues that have been coming up in the chat box, which have been really fascinating about the role of media accountability and the ways that the media itself is not a neutral actor and selects who gets to be part of the story about gun violence. So just any thoughts that people want to share either on the phone or via the chat box about who they would want to see in the stories or who they would who they think should really be part of shaping media narratives about different kinds of gun violence in California or broadly. Give people a second to ruminate. It's a big question. Well, you know what? We'll have Daphne move on to the next piece of the puzzle, where we're going to be talking about who gets to have a role in the frame, for better or for worse, and if the thoughts come up for folks on who should or shouldn't be part of the narrative, or what surprises you or doesn't about this work, we'll be really excited to hear it.
Great. Thank you, Pam. Well, we're going to talk a bit about who speaks in the news, and this might give you a chance to think when you hear about whose voices are represented in the news about gun violence. When we get to our questions and comments section at the end. This might give you trigger some ideas of who we wish we are seeing more of in this narrative.
Daphne, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we just got a few different notes in the chat box in terms of whose voices should appear. Eve says public health, survivors, if any, and families. And then Steve mentions voices including research and CDC.
Oh, wow. Oh, thank you, Heather, for interjecting that. And thank you, Eve and Steve. Those are really, really good points. And
as we'll see here, perhaps not reflected in the actual, and I love this too comment from Sandra Martinez, people of color and particularly researchers, and that's going to be a huge piece of when we're talking especially about what we were seeing through the visual analysis of photographs, sort of speaking to Anara's earlier points as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, so it's with a bit of a heavy heart that I present this and most of these slides, because the speakers that we most often saw in the news about gun violence were criminal justice speakers. Overwhelmingly, you can see this was the case. Criminal justice speakers dominated in all categories, but this was especially true for the news about community violence. And here again, I'll orient you to the chart. So the blue line is community violence, the red line is domestic violence, the green line is suicide. And of course, we know that criminal justice is an important part of this issue, but we would have liked to, we would like to see a variety of voices being elevated, which unfortunately wasn't the case. 59% of the speakers in community violence were criminal justice, 36% in domestic violence for criminal justice, and that's 21% for the suicide stories. We also saw that an absence of health and advocacy group speakers, especially in community violence. However, health, research, and community resident speakers were much more common in the suicide news articles. As you can see, that green line is just sticking out, a bit further for those categories. And this tells us something. This absence of health and advocacy group speakers, for all forms of gun violence, it tells us what's missing from the narrative, and also where there's an opportunity to tell a more comprehensive story about gun violence. So, as Kim mentioned, we wanted to see, we know that what's in the news goes beyond the words on paper. So we analyzed the photos accompanying the articles because we really wanted to see what characterizations of gun violence go unwritten. On this slide, you can see our analysis of photos accompanying stories about community violence. And while the articles rarely mention race, the pictures tell a certain story to news consumers that is not being written. So we found that the news coverage about guns and community violence only included 13% of these articles included an overt mention to race. And then we'll discuss this for suicide and domestic violence in the next few slides. But for those articles, only 8% in each category included overt references to race. But the pictures associated with the articles about gun violence could reinforce problematic ideas about race, gender, and gun violence when we see who is pictured. Indeed, it was across the board, 65% of the images in our sample were people of color. So here in the community violence, you can see a troubling picture that is being painted. The majority of images of people accused of gun violence were people of color. That's 90% of the photos, and specifically men of color. And also, when victims of gun violence appeared, these were also usually people of color, and that was 93% of the photos. In stark contrast to this, white people, and the majority of them white men, appeared primarily as criminal justice representatives, rather than as victims or as perpetrators of violence. So this is telling news consumers a certain story about who violence is happening to. Here you can see that we chose not to reprint the typical photo of the accused because this was a mugshot of a man of color, and we have chosen not to reprint this type of photo because doing so can reinforce negative stereotypes that we are trying to get away from, so we didn't print that here. So then the news about domestic violence, in our analysis of these photos, we saw a similar pattern. The majority, again, of criminal justice representative pictures were white men, and the majority of the accused of gun violence were men of color. Again, we didn't want to reprint that here because we're really trying to move away from that problematic framing. So, we want to be practicing what we preach, so we did not include that photo here. Most of the victims that appeared were women, and about half of them were women of color. So again, this is just the pictures. Although the articles aren't talking about race or social inequities, the pictures are sending a different message. The photos accompanying the news about suicide were slightly different, and this was because there were just so few. Many of these articles did not include pictures, and this could have something to do with guidelines about reporting on suicide. When we did see photos in the suicide sample, these were often either criminal justice representatives or, in the case of a famous suicide, so there was an actor pictured here who died of suicide, and his father, a professional golfer, but really across the board, we saw very few articles at this time.
And I think this gets to the point that Inara also had raised earlier about sort of ideal narratives or potentially ideal narratives around suicide, is that like all the other, like each of the three different topic areas, these stories are so focused on individual acts of crime or self-harm that the focus then becomes on pictures of individuals, and there's much less of a space to visualize the issue more broadly writ, or solutions, or impacts on communities, or any number of other things that might be more associated with stories that give us that broader landscape view and that talk about changing norms around, for example, suicide.
Thanks, Pam. So we also thought about how portrayals of the impact of gun violence are being covered in the news. Something we saw quite frequently was a focus on individuals and the families of victims, the impact of gun violence directly on individuals, either family members or friends. And this, this is kind of what we would expect to see with the specific incident framing. For example, here we see a few quotes. The first one comes from the father of a victim of gun violence who said, "It's hard to adjust to life without her. My heart aches every day." And both of these quotes show, that the heart-rending effects of gun violence, and we did see these types of quotes fairly frequently in our sample. However, what we saw less frequently was the impact of gun violence on communities. So here we see a quote from about there was a school shooting in San Bernardino County. It was an incident of domestic violence where a man shot his wife and some of her students. And this all too rare type quote really describes the impact on the community. So in this instance, everyone was impacted. The family members of the victims whose lives have been forever changed, the parents of the children in the school who are now incredibly worried about the long-lasting impact of what their children have experienced. And this, the fact that we saw this type of article so rarely means that, it really makes us think about missed opportunities to talk about individual or community-wide trauma and the long-term impacts of gun violence. So thinking about this, kind of the context surrounding gun violence, we also wanted to see what kinds of causes, what context was being presented in the news about gun violence, what were we seeing as causal factors. And when we looked at these discussions, you can see that they were fairly infrequent. I am going to we gave you this chart just to put it into context. So you can see here, the most, the highest place on this chart is about 15%. So root causes of gun violence were seldom mentioned. Just to zoom in on this a bit, Here you can see, across the board, although there was very little discussion of root causes, what discussion there was of causal factors emphasized individual choices. And this was particularly true in the news about suicide and guns, with 13% of the articles bringing up individual choices as a cause, and 11% of articles in domestic violence and guns. Then we saw government, policy or legislation, gun culture, and I'll let you all take in this chart for yourself. But one thing that I do want to draw your attention to is that although we have, I think I'm just looking on the chart, I'm just orienting myself as well, environmental inequities as number 4. So although certain communities are more impacted than others by the impact of gun violence, mentions of social inequities and other systemic issues were rarely presented in the news. We did see these a bit more in the news about community violence. This was in 12% of these articles, and this might have been a mention that, well, this neighborhood, you know, is plagued by more gun violence fatalities than that neighborhood over there, and why is this the case? But we only saw these in 2% of articles about suicide and 5% of articles about domestic violence. And just when we're talking about social inequities, we're talking about poverty, racism, education, and other structural inequities. So just looking at the top 3 that we saw here, the individual actions, policy, and gun culture, some examples of this are on this slide. So this is like, you know, a classic example of individual actions. It's kind of using the bad apple frame and putting the actions on just solely to the actions of an individual. And the example of the flawed policy root cause, and then also gun culture as a root cause. But just to flag, these appeared so infrequently, so it's important to mention that while we want to highlight the ones that did, most of the articles did not discuss causal factors at all. And as mentioned, the news rarely included discussion of environmental factors that affect gun violence. Here's one rare but powerful quote from an after-school program manager in Oakland, who made the connection between gun violence and systemic oppression and poverty that is experienced in this community. And we did not see many quotes like this, but here was one example. So I'm going to hand back to Pamela because we're just going to throw it back to all of you for a little discussion.
First of all, Debbie, do you mind just going back to that previous slide, because I think it would be really helpful just to read it out. I'll just read it out loud, just in case folks didn't have a chance to digest it. There's a lot of irony, and I think it's not by chance that Trayvon was the one who made the panel. We have to use his life to really make an impact on gun violence, she said Wednesday. This gun violence is a result of systemic oppression and poverty and the violence that the community experiences. It exists because of that, and there has to be a multi-level approach to solving it. Okay, I just wanted to give that a little bit of a space to breathe, because it is rare but powerful, and I'm always excited to see examples of how it can be done, and bringing that kind of multi-level perspective and bringing to the fore some of the oppressions that we need to be talking about. So, you want to add to this one? You know, so there's been, we have this question about what solutions should be listed up, but I actually just want to list up some of what I'm really seeing in the chat box and in some of the comments, which is that there's a really great discussion happening around the importance of shifting media norms and what that looks like, and in terms of who needs to be accessed and who needs to be part of the story, which editors should be brought on board, things like that. So I think that those are really, I just want to elevate that as something that's coming up that I think could be a really interesting and important tangible takeaway of this work and this conversation that we're having together. Any other kinds of things that people want to elevate, lift up, things that they really feel like should be part of the story, or they would ideally be something that we are talking about when we talk about gun violence and what to do about it. I'm also looking in the chat box and also seeing some great examples of people talking about the training that they've been doing, within their own communities of advocates and practitioners and spokespeople to ensure that the messages that are getting out are the ones we want to see. And you know what, I see Brian's got his hand raised, so I'm going to take you off mute here for a sec, Brian, and would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think, you know, we talked about, first of all, I know some of you on the phone were with us in Sacramento a few weeks ago at the Fostering Hope Transforming Communities Summit that we sponsored with Giffords Law Center and the California Alliance for Boys and Men of Color. And it was clear, right? We had a packed room that folks at the community level in California, city, county, and state level, there's a lot of great strategies. There's a lot of evaluated strategies. There's a lot of stuff that's working. But it's interesting to me, and I know we have folks on the phone from Sacramento and Richmond, but, you know, when Advanced Peace was thinking about being adopted in Sacramento and in Stockton, it's like when that work got lifted up as a community, you know, community intervention strategy, it was not the messages we want, right? It was the cash for criminals, hugs for thugs sort of thing. And I know that eventually some of that narrative turned around to be really good, but it's interesting, even when some of these solutions are out there and they're effective and they're working, the media is lazy, it doesn't do the homework. I'm not sure what it is, but even that strategy that's effective is being, the narrative is awful, right? So we saw that play out, right? While you were Berkeley Media Studies Group, right, you all were doing this, it was really interesting to see, wow, that's being lifted up, but boy, it's not being lifted up in the way that we want.
Oh, I'm sorry. We were on mute. I apologize. I'm having some technical issues of my own over here. I want to say thank you for the great point, Brian. And I also wanted to say that when we started planning this webinar, Brian had said that he really wanted it to be pretty small so that there could be a really good discussion. And I'm just delighted to see that happening here and just all the things that we're starting to see coming through in the chat box, a much more vibrant discussion than I think many of us have seen in webinars sometimes, so I'm delighted. And I also wanted to flag an answer to the question that's up on screen here that's in the comment box, the chat box, talking about, you know, the solutions that we tend to see are often really focused on you know, on federal and gun control policy and, you know, abolishing the Second Amendment and so forth. And that's what we tend to see. And then the question is, of course, well, how effective is that, and what could be lifted up in addition or to supplement that, or you know, in place of it, if that's really not the direction we want to go or that we feel is most productive. Public health-oriented solutions haven't been part of that conversation, as he says, and as we're going to see in a moment, that's certainly borne out by some of the research that we've done. So I'm going to turn this back over to Daphne.
Thank you, Pam and Brian. So to look at solutions a bit, in line with previous research that shows that news about gun violence tends to focus on problems rather than how to solve them, we found that solutions appeared very rarely in this sample. They appeared in 29% of all articles across the board. So this kind of is in line with, you know, what we saw about root causes of gun violence. The root causes aren't being talked about, and the solutions aren't being elevated. In terms of what we did see, so we're going to zoom in on this a little bit, as we did with root causes. And again, the line, you know, the highest place on our graph is 14%. So this just gives you an idea of how many solutions we are seeing. Stories about suicide were more likely to discuss solutions than stories about domestic violence or community violence. But really, again, just to keep emphasizing this, but across the board, there were few solutions. And one type of solution that we did see fairly often in the community violence and domestic violence samples was vague calls for unspecified solutions. And these can, you know, leave people without a clear idea of what the solution is. So this might be getting guns off we need to get the guns off the streets. But these vague calls can also reinforce stereotypes, like when it's just a call to keep guns out of the hands of the wrong people. In terms of looking at some examples of the solutions that we did see, You saw organizational policy change was the most common type of solution in our sample. And one example of this is this quote, the first one: "Schools really are the major intersect in the community. It's where our youth are. People in general have a poor understanding of suicide and suicide prevention and how to help. When schools bring in training, that's massive." And some other organizational policy change that we saw was also often in terms of changes to a police department, like a new program to have shot detector technology. Then the second example we have here is changes in be simple. The second most common type of solution we saw, changes in policy. If we really want to make Americans safer, then we should require universal background checks before gun purchases. And then again, the third type of most common solution we saw, which was behavior change or individual action. So this is kind of the counterpoint to the cause, which was individual actions. And here, the type of individual solution we saw is know something, say something. Anyone with information about these homicides can call the violent crime hotline. So this is kind of, these types of solutions put the onus for change on individuals rather than on institutions or systems. Here we see the rare example in our sample. This would, I'll just actually flip back so that you can see, because I know we're really interested in knowing about where community-based solutions appeared. You can see here the third one up from the bottom. So there weren't many community-based solutions being brought up in articles about gun violence in our sample. One rare example came in from this article from the Chico Enterprise Record, and I'll just read it to you all now. "The community leaders involved in the town hall praised the event. It was a great opportunity for youth in our community to come out and have their voices heard," said Terrence Stone, CEO of the Young Visionaries Leadership Institute. "If we want to make our community a better place, we need to walk the walk and talk the talk, and I think today that the law enforcement community in San Bernardino is really listening to what the community has to say."
And I just want to interject here that I think this is really interesting because this is a community-based solution it is also one that brings in law enforcement. So that might be different from other community approaches that we can see and talk about. And I think that that's important to sort of think about how we can bring forward things that bring in other sectors and that don't involve law. And I love, I'm seeing some comments in the chat box, and I also wanted to say that, you know, one of the points that was made was we really need to talk about also what people in communities can do, and how that can amplify and supplement policy and policy approaches, but those policy approaches can't be everything. And I think that the paucity of conversations about community approaches and the work that's happening to reduce gun violence, to prevent it, to heal communities, to, as our colleague Conor Paul says sometimes, lead with love and rage, are really not being elevated, and instead it's all sort of being seen in the political football sphere when solutions show up at all.
Thanks, Sam. So we're going to, please.
Oh, sorry, I just also wanted to flag one other quick thing. On the previous slide, 2 slides previous, when we talked about all the different solutions together, you might have noticed that criminal justice was kind of low on the list, and that might seem surprising given what we know about our country's typical responses to gun violence and other kinds of violence, and also the preponderance of criminal justice speakers. And I did want to note that that's just because there was not really much substantive discussion of criminal justice solutions. There were tons and tons of articles, the majority of them, that referenced criminal justice consequences. So they mentioned that somebody was arrested, arraigned, went to jail, would be on parole, would be experiencing monitoring, things like that. So the criminal justice conversation is happening. It's just not framed as a solution. It's more framed as a fact of the matter in these stories, or a fact of life in these stories.
Thanks, Lynn. So Pam mentioned previously that we also looked at Spanish language news, and these articles are incorporated throughout our sample. But we also wanted to do a deep dive on how articles in the Spanish language newspapers are portraying gun violence. So we analyzed this subset of our sample specifically, and what we found really parallels our findings overall. But even more so than in the English language news, Spanish language news stories about gun violence almost entirely focused on specific incidents. And this was true in, across the 3 areas that we studied. And just in terms of the framing, 88% of the stories in the Spanish language news sample were framed as portraits. So that's, the specific episodic framing of specific incidents. Criminal justice speakers were most often quoted, as in the larger sample. And again, root causes and solutions were largely absent from coverage, even more so than on the previous slides that we looked at. Just a few examples of the types of headlines that we were seeing in the Spanish language news to give you a picture of, of how specific incident focused these stories, where we have on the lower right an armed man dies from suicide in North Hollywood. In the middle, a man tries to kill his wife and 2 children and fails, and then $20,000 are being offered to find the murderers of a 16-year-old girl. So those are pretty typical of the types of headlines that we saw in our Spanish sample. So we talked a lot about what we saw, and throughout we've kind of hinted at what's missing, and sometimes what we'd like to see more of in the news. But we also did see a lot of problematic framing, as we're calling it, and this is coverage that really could reinforce harmful ideas about gun violence. So these problematic frames and themes appear differently in the 3 samples. This picture, and this is a pretty, this picture here kind of exemplifies the type of problematic frame that we saw in the community violence bucket. And these often, so here's a typical quote. And in articles about community violence, the problematic frames often characterize people who commit violence as bad apples, or there was one article that referred to them, and I'm putting some quotation marks, of course, criminals and crazies, monsters. Here you can see in this quote, as a leader of the Gremlin Riders, officials wrote in Martinez's sentencing memo, the defendant serves as the prototype of why and how gangs destroy communities through violence and intimidation by contriving self-serving and morally corrupt code. So this really is focusing entirely on an individual's action and kind of an othering that individual, and rather than talking about the environment and context. Then in the domestic violence sample, we see a kind of different kind of problematic frame. And previous analyses have explored problematic reporting on domestic violence, and these studies have found that harmful news frames can perpetuate stereotypes about domestic violence and blame the victim, or it can lead readers to empathize with the perpetrator. And this is what we see in this example here. This was following the school shooting in San Bernardino, and a community member referred to the shooter who shot his wife and students as a deeply religious man. There were never any signs of violence, which could, again, lead readers to have an idea that it's just like a nice guy who snapped, or, to empathize with the perpetrator. In suicide, I'm just going to give you a warning before we go to that slide. It's a pretty graphic quote, so just to let you know before, and this is, we did see it a bit, pretty frequently, but I just wanted to let you know what's coming before. So here, the problematic frames that we saw in suicide really violated best practice reporting on suicide. And I'll let you read this yourself. I won't read this one out loud. But in guidelines for reporting on suicide, journalists are cautioned to avoid describing the mechanism or where the suicide occurs because the risk of copycat suicides increases when stories include these details. So, but while there were these problematic frames that showed up throughout the sample, we wanted to also see what kind of hopeful language, what kind of optimism appeared in the articles about the possibility of stopping the gun violence epidemic. 8% of the articles in our sample overall had speakers who expressed any optimism about the possibility of ending the gun violence epidemic. And a full 92% of our sample did not include any of this language. But we want to leave you with this quote before we conclude, and this one comes from a California State Assembly member, Mike Gibson. And I'll just read it to you because it is a pretty powerful quote. I believe that we have what it takes to rise above the political division and enact laws that will strengthen public safety and reduce the plague of gun violence. I will never stop fighting for the right for residents to live in a safe and prosperous community. So with that, we'll go through our conclusions. I know there's been a lot to take in, and thank you all for sitting through, what we're a very comprehensive overview of findings, just because there's a lot since we studied 3 different areas. And I just want to reiterate that all of this is in the issue that I know has been posted in the chat box, so we go into everything in more detail there. To kind of sum up what we found in our analysis, there are major gaps in the narrative, and this is particularly true with suicide and domestic violence and how they connect to gun violence. Specific incidents and individualized framing dominate the coverage, and this could limit discussions of solutions. And most articles frame gun violence through a criminal justice lens, which obscures context, consequences, and communities. And finally, the pictures accompanying stories about community and domestic gun violence could reinforce stereotypes about young men of color. So now I'm going to hand back over to Pam for discussion.
We have had, thank you, Daphne, first of all, for incredible research and a fantastic presentation that really took us through a tremendous amount of work and some really complex pieces of data. There's been a really vibrant discussion happening in the chat box. Thank you all, and just a friendly reminder again to please select all participants when you want to send a message so that we can all see it. There's been really, really good conversations happening about a wide-ranging sphere of things. So I guess I would like to quickly ask, we'll talk a little bit about some of the recommendations that we came to, although I've heard it seems like people in this space certainly have a lot of great ideas and are doing a lot of important things. So I would love to hear, I guess, what surprised you, what would you like to learn more about, or what do you see as some next steps? And please feel free to use the chat box, or if you want, just raise your hand and we will take you off mute and we can have a little bit of a more in-person discussion. I'll say that, let's see, we've had some really good, again, one of the big conversations that we really saw happening here in the chat box was certainly around the importance of changing norms and shifting conversations that are, shifting work and the ways things are happening in newsrooms, and also even thinking beyond mainstream media and its limitations, and thinking about things like disrupting kind of traditional patterns in the way that the media works, and in lifting up community-driven media. We've heard about getting this kind of research and others to editors. And we've heard a lot about different policy solutions and approaches that people are talking and thinking about as key tools to shift the conversation. We've also heard a little bit about how things have changed around the aftermath of Parkland. And I see a comment, I was surprised at the lack of op-ed pieces. That seems to be a relatively easy way to get coverage, assuming they get printed. This is from Eve Sheedy. And this is a great point, Eve, and certainly, of course, there is always the question of what gets printed and what gets selected, but certainly one of our recommendations, as you'll see in a moment, is to take advantage of that space as an opportunity to become part of and affect change in the narrative around gun violence. I would certainly say a piece that surprised me, I guess I'll say, is I think probably because of the media circles in which I surround myself, was the overall absence of domestic violence coverage and the linkages between, the well-documented linkages between, for example, domestic violence and mass shootings. Certainly not very visible in the mainstream press, which points, again, to some of the comments and questions that have been raised around what is happening in other media spaces, which I think is certainly an important area for future discussion and research.
Thanks so much, Pam. Well, I will just take us quickly through the recommendations so that we have time to have a bit of a larger discussion at the end of the webinar. And just to reiterate, these are all available in the issue and with much more context around all of them, and we provide some examples. I'll just take you through them very quickly now. So we wanted to know, and we're sure everyone in this space is asking, what can advocates do to broaden the narrative about gun violence? So one of the ways to do this is create news about prevention. In practice, this means pitching stories to reporters that focus on actions, initiatives, policies that are designed to prevent gun violence. Contribute opinion pieces. So this is a great point from Eve, and actually one example that we highlight is of a way to reactively contribute opinion piece is to highlight those gun deaths that do not make headlines in the aftermath of a mass shooting when guns are very much part of the national debate. Prepare for the long term by building relationships with journalists. If advocates can become trusted sources, reporters have somewhere to go for data and information when they have a story to tell, and otherwise many journalists may rely on their traditional contacts in criminal justice. Talk concretely about context and solutions. So whether advocates are creating news or reacting to a reporter's questions after a tragedy, they can help reporters see that landscape beyond the gruesome details of a specific incident of gun violence. Prepare and share compelling story elements that illustrate the context. Advocates can make it easier for reporters to include context if they have statistics, media bites, visuals, other story elements at the ready. And as we saw in the analysis, visuals are particularly important here. So we can just think about what visuals can be provided to journalists to help them tell a complete and fair story about prevention, the community, and the violence that advocates are trying to address. And finally, talk about race and equity issues as they relate to gun violence. As we know, gun violence is a confluence of many, many complex environmental factors like poverty, racism, and other structural inequities. However, these connections were rarely highlighted in the news. So advocates have an opportunity to really elevate these issues in the context of gun violence. So with that, I'm going to hand back over to Pam, and thank you, everyone.
And I wanted to, we have about 10 minutes left, and in recognition of that, and also of allowing Brian some additional closing comments, I'll just, put this question out to the group. Again, thanks to Daphne, and ask, who does a good job of communicating about the gun violence epidemic? What do they do well? What would you like to see more of? And also to lift up the work that's happening for the folks are talking about that they themselves and their colleagues and networks are doing in the chat box. It's clear that this is an issue that people are galvanized around and are working hard to end. I think that I wanted to lift up also just a couple of great points that came up that Eve commented on the absence of stories about the full impact of gun violence and DV, including the ways that guns are used in non-lethal ways to coerce and control. Lori Cappy points out the very real limitations and difficulties of getting op-eds printed, and points out that somewhat easier and still read are letters to the editor. I appreciate always that emphasis and thinking about the realities of the media environment. I also, again, want to lift up to the larger thinking that has been surfaced again and again here, and that I think we are really excited to continue talking and thinking about together around, getting to editors and sort of changing some of the top-down practice of media. I'd like to see an analysis of deflection of talking points of politicians through things like thoughts and prayers. Now is not the time to discuss. City has the toughest laws, arm everyone, can't stop criminals from getting a gun. These are all really points that we see and hear a lot, and I think that certainly a key piece of future narrative change work would be around exploring ways to address those, redirect the conversation, and also, to Daphne's point, to think strategically and in the long term about how we take the fact that there will always be more tragedies and think about how we can respect, honor, and mourn those tragedies while also creating space to talk about the many tragedies, the lived and daily tragedies that are generating thousands and thousands of stories. I wanted to say thanks to Inara, who comments on physicians doing a good job of communicating, and we certainly saw that in the suicide coverage, which was quite different in many respects from the domestic violence and community violence coverage, especially in just the preponderance of really powerful and passionate comments from researchers and public health folks who are much more visible there than other types of gun violence narratives. With that said, I'm going to pass this over to Brian to kind of wrap us up and say a little bit more about what some of the thinking is, next steps, and I'm certainly very excited about some of the opportunities that are being raised in the comments around possibly some partnerships, some ways to leverage this data with other audiences, and also just the opportunity to get this to a broader community. So Brian, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Pam. Thanks, Daphne, for their great presentation. And again, thank you for all of your work. It was as good as I thought it would be, and even better. And also thanks, everybody, for a great discussion. I knew from the invitee list, because I think I know most of you, it was going to be a really great and engaging conversation. It has been, so I really appreciate all your time and thoughts. And please reach out to me with your thoughts on, some things that you'd like to talk about in terms of this conversation and next steps. But, one of the things, obviously, at Hope and Heal we're trying to do, and we're investigating and exploring, is the next steps, right? So we have a baseline, we have the frame here in California, what gun violence looks like in the media, but obviously that's just a first step. And so, we're at Hope and Heal, we're exploring those next steps. We want to find out the messages and messengers that resonate in the community. We want to be able to test those messages and messengers. We want to help train advocates, and we want to help train the media. So we'll be definitely in touch in the near future, because this is a really important project that can't end here with this. But that said, this is great. This is when I first came in the door and spoke to you all at Berkeley Media Studies Group. This is exactly what we at Hope and Heal had in mind, and it's just fabulous. So I really, really appreciate all the effort. So with that, I will pass it back over to you all at Berkeley Media Studies Group. And again, thanks everybody for a great conversation today.
Right, I think you might still be the presenter. I'm going to pass the back over to her. Thank you so much. Well, it has been certainly one of the most interesting and rich conversations I've ever had in a webinar format, or really indeed in any format. I'm so excited to continue this conversation here and elsewhere. I'll put up our contact information. I'm sure most of you have it, but we're always delighted to connect further. And if any other questions come up, I see a request in the chat box for follow-up numbers on any articles that originated out of state. We can run those numbers and include that in the text of the follow-up email that we'll send to all participants, so you can see that as just a little additional tidbit. As we certainly did see some printed from AP, New York Times, et cetera, that were not originating within the state, and that reflects the national scope of this conversation, even in a local context. If there are any other questions people want to surface, we certainly have the chat box and the raise hand function. We'll be here for a minute or two more. But otherwise, I think I'll just wrap up by saying thank you all so much for being here today, for sitting with us the whole hour and a half, for showing up, for being present, and for engaging with us. We're really, really anxious to continue thinking about how we can disseminate this information, think about ways to strategically share it with some of the different stakeholders and gatekeepers we've talked about who have a role in shaping the media landscape, in partnering, and in moving forward in ways to change the narrative to one that encompasses everyone, that focuses on safety, equity, justice, and community for everyone. Thank you again all so much for your participation and again for being so present with us. And we will be sending out a follow-up email with a link to this webinar, which has been recorded, a link to the final publication, that additional little bit of data that people wanted, and we hope that you won't hesitate to reach out about some of these partnerships and possible collaborations and opportunities to work together that have come up in the chat box. Thank you all so very, very much.